Nice to see you again, Carl.
Good to see you, Joe.
Hal?
Good morning, Carl. A little while ago, we had talked about symbolic interaction and Carl Couch's perspective of sociology, and now we want to move into an area that might almost be called a linear logo for Carl Couch at one particular time, and that's the new Iowa School.
So the first thing we'd like to ask you, Carl, of course, is what is the new Iowa School? What is the new Iowa School?
Well, that's rather difficult to give a quick answer to. And the background is that an article was written several years ago by Bernie Meltzer and Jerome Manis on the Iowa School versus the Chicago School. The article basically was a pack of lies, but the terms got out there. And so those terms became kind of common, and then starting in about 69, I guess, when I was here, after I'd been here a few years, I and a few other people, mostly grad students, started up another research program which was very strongly influenced by the interest of Manfred Kuhn, who was interested in the idea of a science of social phenomenon. But whereas Kuhn developed a program of obtaining data largely through questionnaires, not entirely, but largely through questionnaires, the methodology that we were hammering out was one that obtained data largely through videotaping, and more specifically videotaping within the laboratory context. We achieved some success at that, presented some papers, and somebody else, I think Richard Travisano, I'm not sure who was the first, referred to us as the new Iowa School, and the name has stuck ever since. So basically that's how it happened.
Well, it's a term that refers to this particular methodology of using videotapes in laboratory situations?
Yeah, I'd say so. To a large extent, that's what it's the reference is. The use of videotape to preserve data and the analysis of data preserved on videotape. And also, to most people, I think it denotes laboratory research. I certainly don't see it as being limited to that, but that's common belief about it anyway.
What else could it be applied to besides lab work?
Oh, any kind of field study or
bring it out in the field with you.
Yeah, and certainly people who've been affiliated with me have done field studies, obtained data through so-called naturalistic observation and whatnot.
And is this better than just plain naturalistic observation using videotape?
Yeah, well, see, that's a very complicated issue, Joe, damn it. Most of the people, not all of them by any means, but most of the people who advocate the naturalistic observation claim that you have to leave the phenomenon under investigation in its natural state. You cannot manipulate or control the phenomenon under investigation without mangling it or destroying it. I mean, that belief stems very much from the writings of Herb Bloomer, and who claimed to be offering a methodology that was compatible with George Herbert Mead's ontology, and he claimed that naturalistic observation was in the tradition of Charles Darwin, and that was the route to the future for social science. As it's put in practice, much so-called naturalistic observation becomes what I would call witless ethnography.
Witless ethnography?
Yeah.
Would you care to define that?
Ethnographies with no sociological framework, no sociological theory informing it.
Description.
Descriptions, or as some people have referred to it, and I've done it, high-class journalism. Except some of it's not very high-class journalism.
Is there not a place for descriptive work in
Well, I don't have
social
any problem
science?
with ethnographies. But I think there's a little more to science or social science than ethnographies. And certainly ethnographies open up new doors for us, new vistas, if you will. But one of the problems we've got to confront, as sociologists or social science in general have to confront, is the tremendous complexity of human activity and social life. And to limit yourself to only unaided, naked eye and ear observation is putting a real handicap on yourself. Not that it's not the source of good data, but it's got some very serious limitations. And those that, particularly those people who identify themselves as qualitative researchers, how to recognize those limitations, and they also how to recognize the fact that you exercise control over yourself and over some control of those that's under investigation. Does not mean it's non-qualitative. Okay.
Uh-huh. Uh-huh. Well, sure, every approach has benefits and limitations. Any limitations to the approach you're advocating in using the
Well, it
video
depends
in the
what you
lab?
want to do. Okay.
Uh-huh.
From the beginning, what we were interested in, or at least the central interest, I wouldn't say the only interest, but the central interest was formulating some generic propositions or lawful statements about social processes. And certainly if that's one of your central interests, then it seems to me that the laboratory plus recording devices is a very powerful tool. It's a technique, a technology, that's all it is. And let's don't make it any more than that. It's sort of like the analogy I use. I mean, you can be a biologist without using a microscope. But
Sure.
if you want to be a biologist in the modern world, the one that's got the microscope has got advantages over the one that won't use one. And I would make the same argument for social science, is that people who use video recording technology and or the lab, or the two in combination, certainly have got an advantage over people who refuse to consider that as a possible methodology or possible technology, if you will, to acquire and preserve data.
Maybe the two of them in conjunction?
Yeah, I don't see. Yeah, I see. Another analogy I've used is those who subscribe to the idea that it's supposed to be naturalistic observation. The only legitimate way of generating data is through naturalistic observation. If they were biologists, they put themselves in the same position as if biologists would say, I won't do anything that violates the procedures that Darwin followed when he obtained data for that resulted in his theory of evolution. That rules out Mendelian biology. And the bulk of the people in biology are, of course, are following Mendelian procedures in terms of research procedures, much more so than they are Darwin. But they're not incompatible.
Two sides of the same
Yeah,
thing.
right. And I certainly don't see so-called naturalistic observations being incompatible with laboratory research. Let me add, there's another kind of footnote, I think a lot of the negative response to laboratory research on the part of qualitative sociologists, symbolic interactionists, and those kind of people stems from their belief that the only way you can use the laboratory is in the manner that it has been used by people, for example, like the Stanford people, the status expectation states research trust, which is a way, when the laboratory is used in that fashion, social phenomena are no longer the issue, are no longer the focus of attention. The focus of attention becomes the behavior of individuals in extremely controlled contexts. And if you're going to make powerful use, effective use of the laboratory for sociological purposes, you've got to create laboratory contexts in which there are social processes, not just individuals responding to flashing lights. And certainly I would see that as being as important, the fact that we created a laboratory context in which people were interacting, acting in unison, acting with respect to one another, acting with and with respect to one another. I see that as critical as the lab itself, and certainly as critical as the videotape technology in terms of methodological procedure. The cliche I've used for years is the minimum unit of analysis for us is the dyad. Two or more people capable of independent action, acting interdependently. We will not look at anything smaller than that. It seems to me that that's the minimum unit of analysis for any meaningful sociological studies.
Okay. In terms of what you've just said, let's back up a bit, and you mentioned questionnaires that emerged out of a line of thought following after Kuhn. Can you use questionnaires in the type of approach you advocate? I mean, you're not against naturalistic
I suppose
observation.
you're going to use questionnaires. I think it's basically a waste of time.
Why is that?
Well, I think you can get information through questionnaires that is very good as far as administration or administrative procedures are concerned. But if the name of the game is to formulate some kind of universal statements about social processes, somehow we got to look at social processes, and one of the things the questionnaires can't do is do that. I mean, at the best, questionnaires give you a point-in-time snapshot approach, as opposed to a cross-time or processual approach. And so, at the absolute minimum, if you're going to use questionnaires, you got to ask questions about relationships, as opposed to personal characteristics or attributes and that sort of thing, or demographic factors. And then secondly, you've got to do at least a two-shot affair, time one, time two, and infer the process between time one and time two to get any useful data. If the name of the game is to formulate general processes, statements about processes, general statements about social processes. Now, that doesn't mean the questionnaires aren't useful for applied research, okay? And they're not useful, and it does not mean it's not useful for administrative problems, because they are. But
in terms of what you do, it sounds like it's supplementary.
Right. In terms of what I see as my primary interest, I see them useless. I don't know. See what's coming before us.
Well, that the description that you've given so far of the New Iowa School is somewhat in agreement with what a visible scholar called, we believe this work, when he was writing, he meant the New Iowa School, has promise of becoming an approach which others can adopt to organize their research and teaching activities and thereby further illuminate the human condition. So in that sense, it is a research methodology, it has a theoretical orientation that's adhered to it. But NIS, the New Iowa School, has also been criticized for not developing the approach. For example, one of the criticisms has been that there's this notion of the multi-method, multi-trait aspect of research and methodology has not been addressed and incorporated, and yet the technological side of the New Iowa School has the capacity, because it is recorded, to be analyzed. It would seem to some people anyhow that New Iowa School is very prime for a multi-method, multi-trait approach, or being incorporated in the approach. Have you had that? Have you had to deal with that criticism before of this multi-method?
Oh, I guess. See, I don't understand the phrase. I really don't understand the phrase multi-trait. What do they mean? What do you mean by that?
Very possibly, I'm not going to speak for others, but very possibly this process that you're talking about, when you have a theoretically informed study, and I have personally seen you conduct such studies here, it is possible to have very specific questions when you design that, that you don't know how the answer is what the answer, the range of answers are going to be.
Sure.
And in your recording of the spontaneity that student subjects have shown, they have taken and given you particular answers. Now, but that's the process. That's just one aspect of the overall process.
Sure.
And you identify traits, and you
Well, I don't know
publish
we
them.
didn't identify traits. See, the word traits to me implies a characteristic of an individual.
No, I don't mean it that way. That's why I say I don't want to speak for others, but
yeah.
a trait which is characteristic of a process,
All right, sure.
and which
All right,
I would
we use the
understand.
term elements, all right? Social elements, elements of association. We
Right.
use those kinds of terms.
Principles.
Well, yeah, but when we're talking
Somewhat,
about
but-
principles, we're talking about how do particular elements cluster together to have certain
Okay.
consequences.
Right. So traits then would be things that, if you would have another theoretical orientation, another iteration, a development of theory, you would be able to say, well, let's go look at those tapes that we
Right.
did of such and such negotiation process, and now we're going to look for these things.
Sure.
But that doesn't seem to have happened. Now,
Well,
multi-method would tie in with it in that what other methods could be brought to bear. Now, if indeed it doesn't fit, then indeed this multi-method, multi-trait criticism is a straw man.
Yeah, I have trouble confronting the problem. I really do. I don't understand it very well.
Okay.
As far as I'm concerned, data's everywhere, okay? And the problem is, or one of the big problems we have as sociologists with the data is to avoid being overwhelmed by it. And one of the things that happens to a lot of people when they go out in the field, in quotes, however they go out there, is they get overwhelmed by it. Another thing that happens is they observe, they see and hear so many things that they don't have anything close to a comprehensive recall of what they saw and heard, okay? The powers of this is that if it's properly used, you avoid those problems in part, okay? Not that you avoid them entirely, but you avoid them in part. I really have a hard time coming to grips with this criticism. I really do.
Let me be more specific,
All right.
because indeed it may be a straw problem or straw man type thing,
Okay.
but in a study that you've done in the past, you videotaped representatives from doing negotiations.
Yeah, right.
And these representatives were representatives of groups. They had a general scenario. They had goals.
Right,
They had time limitations.
right.
And one of the things that was produced about that process was a transcript of the language, and in addition to the actual language in the transcript, there were also comments about body movements,
Yes,
distance from each other.
right.
Now, is it possible that multi-trait would be an examination of how well distances, if there are patterns of distance and word correlations that are repeated over and over, that would fit as examples of your elements? We're still talking process.
Yeah,
We're talking
yeah,
elements of
yeah.
process, and then we see a more precise or finer tuned association with the actual words used, body language, distance from each other.
Yeah, well, see, when you use terms like words used, body language, I think it's a misreading in part of what we're attempting to do. And I think it's a mistake a lot of people have made in sociology. What we've been attempting to do is to specify how it is that two or more people pull off something, get something established, get something done.
Cooperation.
Yeah, most things of any complexity involves some degree of cooperation, okay? The phrase that was very pervasive in our discussions in the early years was the word coordinated activity or coordinated behavior. How is behavior coordinated? Now, one of the key concepts that we have, terms that we developed is reciprocal attentiveness. Another one is mutual responsiveness, and you're familiar with those terms, and I will use them. Now, see, from our point of view, it's not the words, it's not the body language per se that's important. It's whether or not reciprocal attentiveness was established. Now, reciprocal attentiveness can be established in a number of ways. Namely, one, make eye contact.
Body language.
One of us can touch the other one, okay? Or I can say, "Hey, Al," and you respond verbally or orally, okay? So our concern is specifying what we think of as these strains of connectedness between two people, and how they are established and how they are woven together by the participants, all right? So we're not interested in the words per se. We're not interested in the fact that I lean forward to you, okay? We're interested in maybe getting some indication of the intensity of the interaction between you and I, okay? There's some way of characterizing it's intense confrontation, or laid-back confrontation, I guess, too, okay? But that could be varied by tone of voice, rapidity of speech, by body language, by me calling you a bad name, or you calling me a bad name. You wouldn't do that, of course.
Well, this all seems to be kind of an example of what symbolic interaction overall, and certainly the New Iowa School is no exception, of a tendency to be very abstract, somewhat defensive about the use of these abstract terms.
I'm not defensive about it.
But still, when push comes to shove, if a brand new student is introduced, a brand new student in the sense of
somebody who's naive about this,
naive about this whole process, one of the first things that they must do is write down the language. Look at these are all empirical, quantitative things. Now
they're all empirical, and this is empirical, I guess, in a sense, is quantitative. Presence, absence, that's quantitative.
Sure, and that's all I'm talking about, because then we might find that very similar phrases are used, or there are patterns that support this idea of principles. Generic principles, in fact.
Right.
That might be going on. So you can understand how someone outside of the New Iowa School might say, well, they can't have it both ways. And indeed try to pin down the New Iowa School as a quantitative school with this flair as well as focus on such things as the mutual strands, the generic principles.
Well, certainly we are empirical.
Can you be empirical without counting it, without measuring it?
Well, I don't think old Charles Darwin did too much in the way of counting. And I would say he was awfully empirical. I mean, he kept looking at data. He kept going around sticking his nose here and there and trying to figure out what the devil it was he saw. And I certainly, in principle, have nothing against counting. I mean, I can count up to 4 at least. It's no big deal. But when you equate the scientific enterprise with counting, that must be pretty close to the ultimate stupidity, I think.
Well, let's back up here a minute, because if indeed you have a general principle, and you just mentioned one, that mutuality.
Well, I got general principle in terms of how do people move from not acting together to doing cooperative behavior. Yeah, I can lay out the elements that people have to do.
So we take an element, and are you saying then, if you want to spin Darwin a couple more times, that we don't have degrees of these elements? We don't
we do, very much. Of course we do.
Do these degrees have significance then?
Of course,
okay.
Absolutely. And therefore, quantification may be used to us.
Well, I'm wondering, because what I would call the younger couch, middle 80s, had turned out an article which was a scathing presentation that there's no way to build a bridge between quantitative and qualitative. However, I mean, they were...
Did I say that?
Well, you may not have said bridge, but something along the line, they're going to boil in their own oil or something.
Yeah,
of the
right.
sort.
I might have said that.
However, the later couch says, by God, these things can, these approaches and philosophies and mentalities can work together to each other's betterment. I would frame that as the later couch, and that it was not too long ago. It would seem then.
Are you talking about my article, that polemic, that subjectivity, objectivity article?
Yes, that's, you want to call it a polemic. Some people might call it as a truce.
I didn't see it that way at all.
Well,
It was, from my point of view, the point of that article was a plague on both your houses.
going back to this business, that indeed the multi-method, multi-trait has been a criticism. It's been a consistent criticism. It's not, and not just directed at SI, of course. Do you see, or have you seen some something that would counter this critique of the multi-method, multi-trait not showing up in the new Iowa school? Could you point to something specifically?
Well, it seems to me that, I'll use myself personally. I've addressed every issue in terms of size of the issue, from how two people walk through a doorway together to how in the hell civilizations emerge. And that's a pretty broad panorama, it strikes me. And
Let's take that business going through the doorway. You got it on tape.
yeah,
You got it in sound.
right.
You do analysis of it. We can measure the distance and blah, blah, blah. Now
You get
take
inter-observer reliability and all that kind of jazz.
everything.
Yeah.
And now we can go ahead and take Joe's notion of the interview and give them an interview about that process. Now,
Why would you want to bother?
that's what I'm wondering. Is that of any value?
I doubt it. Because when you make that assumption, when you adopt that procedure, you're making the assumption that the people you're interviewing are adequate observers. And I did that in the early days when we were perfecting the videotape sort of thing, or that kind of methodology, the laboratory/videotape methodology. We brought people in them and had them engage in activities that we recorded, and then we brought them in the room afterwards and said, "Hey, what were you thinking?
Right.
Give us your assessment." And the most common response we got was, "Well, I must have been thinking X because I'm doing Y." They were using the data that was coming across on the TV monitor to give us answers to the questions we were asking. Now, that's not the same as after the fact asking them, "What was you thinking? What was in your mind? What was your covert acts by an interview without the benefit of the TV monitor?" They'll give you an answer. But what evidence do you have that it's an authentic answer, in the sense that it accurately reflects what the devil was in their mind at that time when they walked through the door? I don't know. See, I think the interview as a technique of acquiring data is grossly overrated. The name of the game is to formulate general ideas about social processes and social relationships. At least that's what I think the name of the game is. How do you interview a process or relationship? Now, you can interview the two people who create the process, or the two people who have the relationship, and put those together. What I find very interesting is that almost no sociologists do that. No, I shouldn't say that. Almost no sociologists who advocate the interview as a way of getting data do that.
Okay.
So they aren't going to get very good data, obviously. I shouldn't say things like that.
Well, we want your insights, and in order to get your insights, we're going to get your opinions too, and there's nothing wrong with that. Question about the new Iowa school, from an outsider's standpoint. In your estimate, do you think the new Iowa school has caught on?
No. And almost no one out there, except people who've been directly involved. have more than a superficial understanding of what we've done.
What needs to be done about that? Or should anything?
I don't know. Well, a lot of things, in the ideal world, lots of things that be done about it. In the ideal world, one of the things that ought to be done about it is we ought to have a research center in which this kind of research is continuing on. We ought to have textbooks of various levels written about it, and that's not happening, or it's not happening as rapidly as it might.
Well, at one time you had CRIB here.
At one time we had CRIB here.
What does CRIB stand for?
It stood for Center for Research in Interpersonal Behavior. And it was set up to study social processes, or if you will. I've forgotten, to tell you the truth, exactly how that term CRIB came about, except once it came out, CRIB, we thought that was cute, and that was that, kind of thing. And it was very viable for, 10, 12 years, and then the department, in its collective wisdom, decided to discontinue that kind of research. And so there isn't any center of that kind of research at the University of Iowa anymore. So
This business, I would like to just kind of follow on about NIS, New Iowa School, catching on. Basically, it has not, according to you, beyond the students that were involved in it.
yeah, there's others out there. There's a few others who kind of wonder what the devil is this stuff all about. What are these Iowa School people got?
Now, aside from such visible scholars, okay, what difference has the New Iowa School made to sociology?
Almost none.
Almost none. Okay. Let's follow on this business about these others that are out there, other than the visible scholars who consider themselves in a position just to criticize, okay? What if you and your students stop writing about NIS?
I don't know. It'll probably piddle away, disappear.
So you're not seeing any indication of academic transmission beyond your immediate students of the New Iowa School?
Oh yeah. There's some. There's some. And it's not. It may not be quite as bleak as what I implied, but it's. There's a few people in the general area of communication, for example, who look at it every now and then and kind of sniff it, see what's going on there. It might be relevant. But in terms of sociology, only within the symbolic interactionists and only a limited number of them, but a number of those, some of them are beginning to suspect that we may have something pretty damn useful. Now, there's a number of reasons why I think it hasn't caught on. It is a radical new paradigm. And it may not, it's a very simple paradigm in a way. I mean, the paradigm, it basically says, damn it, you got to look at dyads. And you got to look at dyads across time. You got to get comprehensive data across time. And so in that sense, it may not seem very radical, but when you compare it to what sociologists in fact do, it is really very radical. Almost no sociologist observe social processes, or social interaction, or social relationships. Almost none of them. And see, you can go point to a lot of things as to why that's the case. But one of the reasons it's the case in sociology in general, it's a long time ago the discipline of sociology made the bet that the methodology was going to be questionnaire data with statistical analysis. And as long as you use questionnaires as your basic data source and do statistical analysis, you have a hard time looking at social processes across time. I mean, you really do. And so, and the other side of the coin is that doing that, particularly using the laboratory or using controls in field studies, sociologically informed controls in field studies, is really a pretty complicated act. There's there are very, very few sociologists who are trained in laboratory procedures in any way, shape, or form. They don't know what in the hell to do with a lab. And what they do is they watch some movie someplace about this is what people call themselves scientists in the lab do, and they try to do that, and they get things all messed up. But in terms of doing what I would regard sociologically informed studies in the lab, very few sociologists know how to do that. Because if we're going to do sociologically informed studies in the lab, one of the things they got to learn how to do is to create, or not take that back, not create, but allow other people to create social processes within certain parameters you specify within the lab.
The stuff that Mead said go out and do,
Yeah,
rather than just sit by and watch.
right.
Then, would it be reasonable at this point to say that it is possible that these and New Iowa School students that you've had in the past, who you have trained in these processes and such, are suspect here?
Suspect in what sense?
Well, are they following the correct path?
Well, I don't know. Some were out there trying. And some were doing pretty good work. Some, I think, didn't quite learn everything. I tried to teach them, but it's okay. I guess if I got an overall complaint, it would be that they haven't worked as hard as I would like to see them work. I think there's a lot of things that need to be done. And, most of them, of course, are not at universities or in departments that are very conducive to doing major research activities. That's a big part of it. And it costs money, it takes time, and all that sort of thing.
One final thing about New Iowa School. What do you think what future contributions would be possible for the New Iowa School? Not in a perfectly ideal world or anything, but just
Sure.
at this point, in the condition
Sure.
that it's in,
Oh,
the students,
sure.
some following the correct path, some caught without adequate resources, on and on. Some reasonable future contribution.
Oh, I don't know. I think that, the major contribution in the relative long range, I suppose, I don't mean, decades down, but within a few decades, it's going to become better known, and it's going to create a greater consciousness of the nature of social processes and relationships and their consequences. And, it's like what's taught today in introductory soc, if you will. I mean, people come out of sociology, they got a new frame of thought, at least a frame of thought that supposedly they didn't have before they went in. Those that get exposed to this will have a frame of thought about social phenomena that they didn't have before. And I say that's a very diffuse kind of thing. Usually when they talk about contributions, you want something much more specific. And one of the things that from the earliest time that we were interested in, that I see as something that would be a real contribution, in specified areas, the whole business of representative relationships. We started doing that research largely because Marion Wine and I had a very similar set of experiences when we'd been representative. We found ourselves behaving in a corrupt and dishonest manner. And we didn't think of ourselves as being those kind of people. And we chatted about that a number of times, and we started to think, well, what happens when you get people speaking on behalf of other people and you get that representative relationship there? So we conducted a number of studies, and then a couple of them were pretty damn good studies of the representative relationship and how it evolves. You don't have to be a great student of government or any government, or government in general, to know that corruption is pretty rampant amongst representatives. One of the things that's going on right now in this nation is we're looking for a cure to that corruption. And one of the things that happened in the last election was we're going to limit terms, as if that's going to take care of the corruption. It may well be something that may minimize corruption. I don't know. We don't know that. But I could see doing a number of studies on representative relationship in which you could document that pretty definitively. Does length of time in the office contribute to corruption?
Well, so that we don't get too abstract or into phantom words here, when you're talking about corruption, you're talking about that not as a cognitive process in the individual, something that we cannot see.
No.
You're talking about specific public behavior that can be observed
Right.
in the lab
Right.
within the framework of one of your experiments.
Right.
Can you think of a good example of
Sure.
how?
The thing that impressed us the most when we first started doing these studies, and we started looking at videotapes, and they just sort of hit you in the face, is these were college students asked to act as representatives. So they were representatives of two other people, and they were to advocate with vis-a-vis another group with their interest. And the thing that shocked me when I first saw it was the frequency with which these representatives would lie to their constituents. And the fact that, this was in the context in which they were told, it's fun and games, kids. We're staying in representative relationship and negotiation. Would you please decide which one you're going to be the representative? Flip a coin, draw, we did a number of ways. And then you find out these people would, after 15 minutes of acting as representative, they'd be little liars. They weren't big liars, but they would come back and make statements. One of my favorite one is the guy comes back, and this was three young males, and they select one of themselves to go as representative, and they goes and argue with another male who's playing the part of the dean, and he comes back and he makes a statement to the effect that he says, "Yeah, I should have seen his eyes bug out when I hit him with such and such." Well, you can look at the videotape of the interaction between him and the dean, and there's no time in which that dean was under any threat of any anxiety or anything like that. His eyes sure in hell didn't bug out. Now, that's my point of corruption. I mean, you could create. Now, there's something about what we call the accountability, the intense accountability of being a representative that generates corruption over time. Exactly what it is, how it operates, we don't know that yet. But I can show you any number of videotapes in which college students, both males and females, become corrupt in the sense that they lie to their friends or to their newly met acquaintances over incidental things. Now, one of the criticisms that you can make of that is it's just incidental things. Well, why should they lie about incidental things? I mean, whether or not you're going to have a job for $130,000 next year is contingent on whether you tell the truth or lie. The chances you're going to lie are pretty great. Now, that's a long-winded response to, but it seems to me there's a lot of research that could be done on that representative relationship that could find out some of the things that go wrong with it. Okay, and maybe there's a vaccine we can produce for. Obviously, I'm being facetious there, but maybe there's certain kinds of social relationships that we can make that minimize the likelihood of them becoming corrupt. At least not corrupt quite so fast, or something like that.
It would certainly seem that with the new world, this flagrant use of the notion of the new world order. The world as a neighborhood, on and on.
Yeah.
Even
Global village.
Global village, and on and on. And a fellow by the name of Reich now is involved with the new federal administration who holds the same idea that this is really just a big market. The whole world is. It would seem then that these things that you're studying, these elements, would hold true, or could be checked to hold true across this idea of culture, or across the groups, regardless of culture.
Sure.
And yet, there seems to be no quote-unquote cross-cultural stuff.
That's true. There's been no cross-cultural stuff that didn't amount to anything. Mm-hmm. That ought to be done. Takes time. Takes people. Takes money. We don't have it. We don't have the resources. No. And it's unlikely that the resources are going to be available in the very near future. I just don't see that as being very likely. But I have no no doubts that the particular relationships that are highly conducive to corruption, to go back to our example, within a representative relationship amongst English-speaking people, are going to be there amongst Japanese-speaking people, there amongst Yak Islanders, I don't care.
Right.
But on the other hand, certainly it ought to be checked. But see, this kind of put a footnote in here. One of our efforts, our central effort, has always been talking about the form of relationships or the form of social processes. Okay, and the idea that has sort of informed that effort is that content be damned. Content is not important. The culture belief systems are not particularly important. It's the nature of relatedness between people that's critical. I basically believe that, but on the other hand, I'm well aware of the fact there is something we might call a form-content bond that we gotta look at. But that's a very complicated issue, and we take a number of major research undertakings to get any kind of what I would think of definitive answers on that. And I don't see them coming forth in the very near future. What are we going to do? Turn it off? Add your mother-in-law.
Well, Carl, you've made a lot of reference to generic principles. I wonder if you could elaborate for us. What are generic principles?
Oh, quick off-the-cuff cliche answer is they are statements about how phenomena are connected with one another that are universally true. And the prototype, I suppose, of a generic principle would be something like Newton's ideas about mass and attraction of bodies, function of the mass of the two bodies, the distance that separates them, or another generic principle, of course, I guess maybe where the term comes from, is Mendel's statements about genetic code being transferred from one generation to the other. It follows a particular pattern. And certainly, it seems to me that that's one of the general tasks of the social science is to formulate some universal statements about social phenomena. And that's been the ideal, I think, of sociology since the founding of the discipline.
So then you're taking the same concept and wanting to make generalizable statements about social processes.
Right. Yes. That are true irrespective of time, geographic location, or culture, or anything like that.
So universal laws.
Universal laws.
Okay.
One of the places where you do reference that, contrary to my earlier talk about and kind of evoke or tendency to evoke that there are not cross-cultural studies, there is a potential for cross-cultural studies in your own work. Most recently, an article, I think it was called Formal Theory of Social Processes,
Right.
in which you mention a reference to tyranny.
Yeah.
Now, is it not possible then that all we have to do is find an example of tyranny in different quote-unquote cultures,
Right.
and we do have the cross-cultural capacity?
Sure. Oh, yeah.
Okay.
I don't see any problem. I mean, in principle, it's an easy thing to do. Now, in terms of practical doing, it's not so easy to do, okay? Because to do it in any kind of definitive manner at all, it takes a fair amount of effort and organization, But no, in principle, there's no problem.
Okay. You'd say then that basically this term generic principles meets Mead's requirement for knowledge. Let me quote that. What we think we know is knowledge only if it has consequences for action. only if it solves problems encountered in action.
Oh, I'd agree.
Okay.
I'd agree. The ultimate test of knowledge, as far as I'm concerned, is will it allow human beings to do something they couldn't do before they had that knowledge? Does it allow them to build an atom bomb, for example? Can they do something now they couldn't do before? That's kind of a stupid example.
Do your generic principles have any predictive abilities?
I don't think prediction is the name of the game at all. I've never thought that. At least I can't remember ever thinking that.
What's the alternative
The
to
alternative
prediction?
prediction is the detection of regularities, the observation, the detection of regularities, and the formulation of assertions, statements about those regularities. And namely, make the statement in the case of some of the stuff we've done, is that if people are acting in unison, they have established reciprocal attention and been mutually responsive. In other words, they've got to do A and B before they can do C. And it's we try to frame those or form those in universal terms.
Earlier, you criticized naturalistic observation for being ethnographic writings, for being primarily descriptive. To me, what you just said sounds as if it's the same. You're just describing what's going on. You're applying terms.
It is description. It's just a matter of the level of description.
So that's the difference between that and the ethnographic works.
Sure. It's description. There's nothing mystical about scientific knowledge. It's simply abstract descriptions. Descriptions that are not tied to time or place.
Okay, so then you don't need to be able to predict.
I don't see prediction as being
Description. What about theory then? How do you go from description to theory?
Well, theory is nothing more than the tying together or the linking together somehow or other a series of generic principles. And certainly, to go back to the thing that Helm referenced the article, this is what I was trying to do there. Not that it's done in any kind of complete fashion, but the linking together of statements about the elements of association that constitute cooperative acts, for example, going from that, talking to about more complex phenomena like negotiating acts, okay, which is a particular form of cooperation, but trying to link the simpler form of cooperation with this more complex, to note how one is built on top of the other and how the two kinds of activities are, oops, tied together. And we got the same problem in terms of social relationships. We're talking about social relationships as growing out of or being built up in interaction. And then we got to talk about the social relationships, their form, if you will. And then we have to talk about the interaction that goes on within these various forms. And we got to link together the processes and relationships. That's hardly begun. That's hardly begun. It's a problem, I think. It's clearly delineated in some of the writings, but it's delineated as a problem. But
not a problem that's been solved.
But you're right, exactly. Thank you.
Well, to kind of build on that, this article, Toward a Formal Theory of Social Processes, do you consider that a program statement?
Well, I guess it certainly implies a program. And in that sense, yes, it's a program statement. Actually, when I wrote it, it was more of a summary statement. Mm-hmm. This is what we've got so far to date. And I tried to get across, and I don't think I did it very well, the idea that, gee, look, we can do a lot more than what's been done within this frame within this program. So in that sense, it's a program statement, yeah, in that latter sense.
We have a quote from a former student of yours. Student said,
"These are always dangerous, right?"
Yes. Yes. To assume that a science of human behavior is possible is to degrade human beings. Well, first of all, do you think that that is so?
No, I certainly do not. And I wish I knew who that student was so I could take away his degree or her degree.
Well, why do you think it's not true?
What do you mean?
Well, you assert, I mean, you don't agree with that, and that's fine. Why? What are the specific reasons?
Well, the particular reason I don't is I see science as being a particular kind of knowledge, a very useful form of knowledge, kind of knowledge. And I see knowledge as something that empowers human beings, not as something that degrades them. And this is, to talk about as something degrading human beings, I just don't understand that. Now, I think what's going on in this particular case, or what must be going on, is that science is being equated with logical positivism or something like that. And, or science is equated with what the logical positives say is science. And if you got that particular conception of science, and I don't know, I can argue very much about whether or not I'd agree, yeah, it's degrading. If you got that conception of science, I think that's a exceedingly truncated conception of science.
Can the same accusation be made of what you do in the laboratory? Is that degrading?
Oh, the accusation can be made. Sure can be made. I certainly don't see what we do in the laboratory as being degrading. I see it on occasion. Obviously, it hasn't degraded people. But it's not intended that. I mean, everything we do may go fly up, blow up in our face and not have the consequence that we intend. I think when you bring people in to participate in the lab and you lie to them as to why you're doing the study, yeah, that's degrading. And I think those studies ought to be outlawed.
So when people come in to participate in your studies, you tell them we're here to study negotiation, and we'd like you to try and negotiate, for instance.
Well, a typical situation is, to use your example, is when we did the studies on representative relationship and negotiation, we told those people that we were studying we were studying representation and negotiation, I think is what we told them. We used different phrases, but they basically came in and expecting to take part in the study, and I don't think they were all that concerned with what they were really doing, to tell you the truth.
Based on the reputation that I'm sure probably exists at any university of people doing laboratory studies with students, I mean, it circulates among the culture of students. I mean, well, you go, you do the study, you make a few dollars, they're going to lie to you and do something they're not talking about. Right. Does that affect these students?
Sure it does. Sure it does.
How do they react when they...
It adds clutter. Because what's going on is they're thinking about things that aren't relevant to what the hell's going on. So you got this noise in the system that's being introduced. And we had a number of people, it wasn't a majority like that, but a significant minority when we were doing those representative studies, when the studies were all done and we go in and ask them if they had any questions and that sort of thing, they'd ask us, what are you studying? We'd say, well, we're studying representation and negotiation or something like that. And then a few of them would say things like, I mean, I know that's what you said. What are you really studying? And certainly those people who are asking those kind of questions are suspicious. And from our point of view, that's noise in the system. I mean, it's bringing an uncontrollable element into the system, and it's something that people who do these studies of social processes and social relationships in the lab for the next several decades is just going to have to live with. We certainly can't eradicate that until a bunch of social scientists and psychologists get their minds screwed on right or something.
So by them doing that, they're contributing to this noise.
It's
being produced by other social scientists.
Sure they are.
I'd like to draw some attention to you personally again, but a particular focus, and that is this relationship of personal integrity and intellectual freedom. For example, we've discussed, or at least some of us have discussed before, how difficult it is to view and review other people's work. They're using different methods, or they have different understandings of methods or theory and such. And yet it seems that the reputation that you have for personal integrity in doing that is very, very high.
Thank you.
Now, my question is less of a question than an appeal for you to elaborate on this business of personal integrity, this relationship of personal integrity and your intellectual role, or what you see as the intellectual role of the academic.
Oh my God. Hell, that's a nasty one. I don't know.
Well, it's...
I don't know what I got anything to say on that. I mean, I'm in this game. I got in this game because I thought it'd be fun. I really did. And I've found it right frustrating lots of times, as you well know. But it's been a fun game. And also I've been able to maintain the illusion, and maybe it's more than an illusion, that maybe I'm quote, contributing something to humanity, you know. Maybe my work is going to allow people to have a little bit better and different lives. I don't know.
Well, I think
that's a grandiose thing.
Okay, now you're kind of jumping ahead here. You're kind of just sliding away from
I know
what some people consider, especially younger academics, consider as a major challenge, and that is how to maintain an intellectual integrity.
how to be honest within a bureaucratic
Yes.
context. It's damn
And
difficult.
yes, what can you point to any particular things other than just your own personal moral integrity and such that would be helpful?
No, I have a hard time. I could, make some statements, but I don't know what the relevance. Since I was a very young man, I've been very disenchanted with elites, if you will. I found that elites, when you get close to them, usually have very, very serious flaws. I've never been a worshiper of elites of any sort.
Okay, you've kind of slid around the other side
Yeah,
of the question. Are you saying basically then that it's historically your experience, what's worked for you, has been in some way so unique and so different that you can't explain it in terms of other people's lives even? And I'm not, I'm not saying you have to.
I don't think I want to come down there. I don't know, Al. I really don't know.
Okay.
It's not that
Maybe we can go after something very specific.
all right.
Well, let me try and rephrase that first.
Okay.
All right.
What sort of advice could you offer a budding scholar so that they would be, in order that they could deal with this relationship between personal integrity in this bureaucratic structure, as you just said? I mean, it's something that you've been able to do. How does another person?
I've been able to do it, but
To some extent, you've produced a body of material.
Right. Well, I think that a number of would-be scholars make the big mistake of trying to please their superordinates, their bosses, when it's not even necessary. For example, kind of thing, many years ago, I was contacted by a young assistant professor who just got me his first job. Who was teaching mass communications in another department and wanted to exchange syllabi with me, which I did. Then we met and had lunch. And one of his statements was, "I wish I could teach what you teach in your course." And I said, "Why not? Why don't you do it?" And he said, "Well, I can't because they don't expect me to cover that kind of stuff and I might get in trouble." I remember making the statement to them, something to the effect of, they don't even know what you're teaching, they wouldn't care less, as long as you meet your classes on time. He was obviously trying to please his chairman. 6 years later, he comes up for tenure and he gets denied tenure. He lost doing it his way, you know. I've never done that. I shouldn't say I've never done it to a degree, but basically I haven't done that sort of thing. I teach my courses in terms of what I think ought to be taught in them. And at the same time, trying to have some understanding that the students got certain legitimate expectations to get certain things out of the course, which I try to cater to. I don't think, for example, on that particular thing, that most assistant professors have to cater to the bureaucratic powers that be as much as they do. You know, that's my point, I guess, that's what I want to make here. The so-called lack of integrity is self-imposed, I guess, to a certain extent. And I think it's very unfortunate.
Seems to me that some of that might be baggage that a number of new professors might be bringing along from their dissertation committees. I mean, they have.
I'm sure.
You've had to satisfy a number of people in that situation.
Right. Exactly.
What's the incentive to stop doing that now?
Well, I think that if you're going to do it there, it's too late. I don't know. I've known any number of people who made statements when they were grad students to the effect of, as soon as I get my PhD, I'm going to do it my way, or I'm going to do what I think is important, not what I've been doing.
So it sounds like then you're saying really you have to start while you're a grad student, doing it your way, and either you make it or you don't. If you participate in the system, you're going to corrupt yourself.
You got to participate in the system.
Well, no, but to the extent that you're catering to the...
You don't have to sell out. You don't have to sell yourself out before they got the gun at your head, at least.
When they have the gun at your head, then...
Then maybe you might sell out.
Okay. I think that may be, in a roundabout way,
has
provided an answer to Hal's original question. Now perhaps we can get into his more specific question.
Well, it is. There's a specific application, and it has to do with the motivation for your focus on the new Iowa school, considering my term, or Joe's term, the ghettoization of the new Iowa school within the Department of Sociology at the University of Iowa. Now, we're not talking days or weeks. We're talking years of this ghettoization to develop, solidify, be legitimated, be supported, and to continue to this day. What keeps you going?
Stupidity. I honestly don't know, Hal. I really don't. I enjoy the game. When I say that I enjoy the game, I mean enjoy doing what I do. I enjoy trying to figure things out. You know, it's like somebody likes to play chess. And every time they get a chance to go play chess. So every time I get to do sociology, I go do sociology, which is a stupid thing to do. And I enjoy that game. The other thing I suppose that keeps me going a little bit is I know I'm right. And what keeps me going a little bit is the joy of being an irritant to these people who think I'm wrong. In the long run, I know I'm right. I don't know. I don't want to keep going. Why not keep going? What should I do? Watch football all week long? Watch the soaps? I enjoy this more, so I'll do this.
Well, that's
not exactly
a wonderful reply for right now. My question probably wasn't properly stated, but what kept you going previously?
Oh, I don't know. I don't know. Very early on in my so-called academic career, I mean, long before I got a PhD, I was bugged by the idea of a science of humanity or a science of the social. That really intrigued me. I just found that fascinating. And even when I was a high school student, I found science, if you will, fascinating. just like some people find chess fascinating. I found the idea of science. Oh, and then I read a few things when I was a very young man about science of the social. And I had the idea of science of the social, if you will, before I think I had it before I had the term sociology. I don't know when I first became acquainted with the term sociology, but I don't think it was until I was a college student. I think I may have taken it in my first course in sociology because I asked somebody what it was. And they tried to explain to me, and it sounded like something that's what I was interested in before. I don't know. But I was fascinated by this. And certainly, this is what I found very attractive about Manfred Kuhn when I was a grad student. Is he was committed to the Western European ideal of science and applying that Western European ideal to humanity. He was very much committed to that, and I found that fascinating, and that's why I gravitated towards him. And he had something a little more about it than most sociologists. I mean, nearly every sociologist. Yeah, I'm interested in doing scientific research on human beings, but to Manfred Kuhn it meant something a little more. It meant, to go back to an earlier point, the formulation of generic principles, universal laws, and that sort of thing. And it was that I just found intriguing. I don't have any other answer for it. And then, after I got out of grad school and went out, I really became aware of the fact that the techniques and whatnot that I learned as a grad student as to how to do that were inadequate, if not misleading. And I don't know, one thing led to the other, and I started doing that stupid recording stuff. Okay.
I think one probably final question. You haven't really taken on, say in the last 6 or 7 years anyhow, any new students that you would be willing to train for PhDs. Any general comments on that? Not that you're necessarily driving them away, but and doesn't seem that you have any.
No. It's actually it was about 10 years ago. I changed my lifestyle, and I had to maintain my sanity. I finally concluded that it was impossible for me to work closely with grad students, to be their advisor in this department, because basically what I found to be acceptable intellectual undertakings were not judged in this department as being acceptable for graduate student degrees. And I fought rather extensively over that with some of my colleagues. And I finally concluded that I was doing myself a lot of harm, namely driving myself nuts. And I sure knew that wasn't doing grad students any good.
That was contributing to them being marginalized.
Yeah, right. And most of them a number of those that were my students were forced out of grad school. And I just didn't want to contribute to that. And then I guess there's a third factor. It was kind of a calculated, what's the most productive route to follow. And I was very aware of the fact that if I was going to continue to do things like being an advisor to grad students when they did their dissertation research, for example, that I was going to have to spend an awful lot of intellectual energy and emotion on protecting them, fighting, and it just wasn't very productive. I just didn't see it as being productive, and so I said, yeah, my time can be better spent becoming an author instead of a researcher. So basically I switched from being a researcher to being an author, and in the last 10 years most of my effort has been writing, and as opposed to doing original research, which is what I saw myself as doing in the late 60s and the 70s. Usually with grad students, as you well know.
Is that? It seems to me, rather than asking you this, make a statement. It seems to me then that that's a direct result of the fact that you're ghettoized or peripheralized
Oh,
or
sure.
marginalized
Oh, sure.
in the department. The
Oh, yeah.
fact that that's contributed to your production of this body of literature.
Yeah, sure. Well, in one sense, yeah. Obviously, I've been more productive if you measure productivity in terms of number of pages turned out. Now, if you talk about productivity in terms of the formation of new ideas and that sort of stuff, I'd have been a hell lot more productive if I could have maintained what was going on in the 70s here. But I simply was not able to maintain it. The other thing that's part of this, too, that's a little difficult to put your finger on is the kind of thing that you ask grad students to do if they're going to do the kind of stuff that goes with this laboratory videotape kind of research. You've got to have another faculty member or two around that they can go to and, quotes, have a sympathetic / critical ear, okay? Sympathetic in the sense they're sympathetic with the general theoretical ideas that inform the research, critical in the sense that they'll look at it, evaluate it, and say, hey, you're not doing this right, or maybe if you do it this other way. And there's nobody else in this department who, in quotes, has got the background. I mean, there's nobody else in this department who's at all trained in symbolic interaction theory, let alone trained in or sympathetic to this particular kind of research methodology. And I guess I'd like to add as a footnote there is that in the heyday, if you will, the good times in the early 70s, Frank Cohout was a member of this faculty, and he and a few others did contribute substantially to that. Those people are no longer faculty members, and so if somebody does work with me in this department, I am the only one in the sense they can go to. You know, it's a single source, and that's just not a way to turn out top-notch intellect. The only thing they're going to get from the other members of this faculty was, you know, partial acceptance from there. Is negation. Don't do that, period. Okay? That's hardly social support. It's hardly constructive criticism. And you both having been grad students in this department once upon a time know damn well what I just said is true.
Right. Which, well, Joe may have thought that was the final question.
All right.
Let's ask a final.
All right.
And there may be more final questions here. There will be, at some point, some students watching this, perhaps undergraduate, and in recognition of them, or students of other disciplines, what would your advice be to students contemplating graduate work in sociology?
Don't go into sociology.
Because?
Because sociology, in all probability, is a dying discipline. I suspect it may have at the most another 50 years. And it's going to go the way of zoology. Just like research in the general field of genetics came along and pushed the specialists in morphology off to the side, there's things developing within the academic world that indicates that sociology is going to be pushed off to the side. My own advice would be to find a Department of Communications that's got, in quotes, a social science influence there. Or a heavy segment of social science kind of thing, and go there if you want to go to grad student and you want to do research to deal with social processes or social relationships. Very few sociology departments train people in how to do research on social processes or relationships. Very few.
When you advise people that want to look at social processes, potential graduate students, and you advise them to go to communications departments, what is it that communication departments are capturing, building? You use the term social science influence. What is it they're doing that sociology departments are not?
Well, they're more open. They're much more open. And that's the first point, which isn't answering your question, I realize. But see, what's happened in most PhD granting, large prestige PhD granting institutions have been captured by the logical positivist and the functionalist, and it's still there, and it's really there in terms of the training program. There is no, what do you want to call it, the dominant paradigm within the communications department by and large. They're all over the map and they're all confused. But so there's a lot of flexibility there, or a lot of sloppiness, whichever way you want to look at it, I guess. But there's also a searching for viable alternatives. And I see what I would think of under the general category of qualitative research and the general category of symbolic interaction theory. Okay? I see those two most likely coming to maturity in communications departments. I think it's very unlikely that sociology departments are going to go through the necessary modifications to incorporate that. I just don't see that as very viable. ASA will disband first. I gotta get that in. Are we quitting?
One last.
Final. All right.
Did you have another one, Joe?
No, I have a final statement to make, but I'll allow you to ask the final question.
Just a quick one. You just made a prediction. I can see you're on a roll. What would you see the reemergence of Berger-Luckman type material as a possible salvation of sociology, or do you think it's even too late for something as great as that?
Well, I don't see the Berger-Luckman as being the source of salvation, okay?
Shoots.
No shoots either, no.
Well, I think
They're
I have a final
culturologists.
question.
They're culturologists. They don't look at social processes.
Well, obviously they do look at social processes. They identify the processes. They break down the processes. They give you categories of the processes. But perhaps that could be another time, another talk.
We're getting a little flaky, Joe.
We must be. The final statement I'd like to make, Carl, is that we both like to thank you for taking these 4 or 5 crazy hours out of your schedule to...
What schedule?
What schedule? Out of your disorganized existence.
Emergent future.
Thank you, Professor
Thank
Carl
you very
DrCouch.
Yeah. What the hell are you guys going to do with all this crap now?
Well,
You don't-